They say legends never really die. But sometimes, their final moments can reveal more about them than all their years of fame ever could. Ozzy Osbourne, famously known as the Prince of Darkness, surprised the world not with a scream, but with a whisper. In his final days, far away from the bright stage lights and loud concerts, something happened that no fan was ready for. His last words were quiet, heartfelt, and deeply emotional. They would break the hearts of those who heard them. What exactly happened during those last moments? And what did he say before everything went silent? By the summer of 2025, people around the world began to feel that something had changed. Ozzy had faced many health problems over the years, but this time felt different. There wasn't any chaos or drama. Instead, there was a strange calm. After decades of loud music, cheering crowds, and wild performances, silence had settled in. And Ozzy, who had always faced the truth head-on, accepted this silence peacefully. He was living at his large country home in Buckinghamshire, England. Over time, the house had become less like a rock star's mansion and more like a quiet care facility. After he announced in 2020 that he had Parkinson's disease, fans began to notice every little detail. His shaking hands, his slower steps, or if his speech sounded slurred. Even though he kept his sense of humor and that rebellious charm, his health was clearly getting worse. By 2023, it was clear that he could no longer perform like he used to. Years of back and spine surgeries, caused by a fall in 2019, had left him with nerve damage that affected his balance and ability to speak clearly. According to family sources, he was always in some level of pain. He stopped touring and cancelled appearances, but when he did speak, people noticed a gentler, more thankful tone. He was still funny, still bold, but there was also a sense of looking back on his life. His wife, Sharon, had been by his side through everything. She was not only his partner but also managed his healthcare and business. By early July 2025, she started limiting who could visit him. Only close family members and trusted staff were allowed inside. The public didn't know how serious things had become. But even when he was weak, Ozzy refused to fade away completely. He still sat with his family at dinner, watched scary movies late at night, and listened to fan letters being read to him on his better days. Those letters reminded him of the fans who loved him for so many years. Then, things took a turn. In late June, the news reported that Ozzy had caught a serious flu. At first, it didn't seem too worrying, but people close to the family said he had to be taken to the hospital. Doctors knew his history and were concerned. They feared the flu would make his Parkinson's symptoms worse and push his already weak immune system too far. He went home after a few days, but something had changed. He wasn't as strong. His movement became very limited, and he needed help with almost everything. Still, he stayed mentally sharp. A nurse once said he was like a man trapped in a body that wouldn't respond. He still made jokes, still asked for his tea just the way he liked it, with the exact amount of sugar. But each moment with his children and each quiet conversation began to feel more emotional. There was a growing sense among those around him. They were watching the final moments of a powerful life slowly coming to a close. In his last days, he spent a lot of time sitting quietly by the window. He didn't stare at anything in particular, just the garden, the trees, the sky, and the birds. Maybe he was thinking about his childhood growing up in Aston. Maybe he was remembering the huge crowds singing his songs. Or maybe he was just letting his thoughts drift, enjoying the peaceful silence after a life of noise and fame. Whatever Ozzy Osbourne was thinking in those final days, he mostly kept it to himself. But something was clear. He was waiting for something. There was a quiet restlessness about him, as if he knew that even after living such an extraordinary life, one final moment still needed to happen. One last memory. One last echo. No one around him knew exactly what it was, but they could feel it coming. And when that moment arrived, it wouldn't happen in front of a massive crowd. It wouldn't be on a stage filled with lights and smoke. It would be something more personal, quiet, deeply human, and it would move the world to tears. But before that final moment came, Ozzy had one more surprise. One more way to remind the world that legends don't simply disappear. They leave behind echoes, reminders of where it all started. On July 5, 2025, as the sun set over Birmingham, Ozzy Osbourne made what would be his final public appearance. It was called Back to the Beginning, a one-night-only event held at Villa Park, just a few miles from his childhood home in Aston. Officially, it was described as a celebration. But to those who truly knew him, it was something much more meaningful. It was a farewell. Sharon Osbourne, his wife and closest supporter, had been working for months to make the event happen. She wanted fans to have one last chance to see him, not as the rock god of the past, but as the man he had become, reflective, vulnerable, and still beloved. It was meant as a thank you to those who had stayed with him through everything, and as a way for Ozzy to say goodbye in his own way, on his terms. He was brought on stage gently, helped onto a custom-built throne placed at the center. The crowd of nearly 50,000 people stood silent. There was no attempt to hide his illness. He looked frail, and the years of pain and struggle were visible on his face. But there was also peace in his eyes. Huge screens showed moments from his life, pictures from his childhood, wild tour videos, and touching clips of quiet times with his family. When he took the microphone, the crowd waited. He didn't give a long speech. He simply said, "I don't know what to say. You've been with me all this time. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." And that was enough. The crowd exploded in applause and cheers. Ozzy didn't sing that night. His performing days were behind him. Instead, he sat and watched. He soaked in the love, the music, the moment. Legendary musicians took the stage to perform in his honor. Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler joined for a haunting version of War Pigs, with Zakk Wylde and other longtime friends playing beside them. Even newer stars like Dave Grohl and Corey Taylor made surprise appearances, paying tribute to the man whose voice had shaped the sound of rebellion for generations. Backstage, emotions were high. Crew members who had worked with Ozzy for decades were seen crying quietly. The show was a celebration, but everyone knew it was also a goodbye. What made the night even more powerful was what it achieved. Though tickets weren't overly expensive, millions watched the live stream around the world. Between streaming, merchandise, and private donations, the event raised over $100 million for Parkinson's research and children's charities, both causes that were close to Ozzy's heart. He had faced Parkinson's himself, and he never forgot the kindness and support he received during his hardest times. Ozzy didn't stay for the whole show. After about an hour, he was quietly taken backstage as the music continued without him. But no one felt disappointed. In fact, it felt like the perfect ending, a quiet departure after a powerful goodbye. That night, fans from all over the world, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Los Angeles, and beyond, flooded social media with videos and memories. Clips of Ozzy's speech were shared again and again. People wrote about what he meant to them, how his music had changed their lives, and how this final appearance had brought both joy and heartbreak. It was clear, even though Ozzy Osbourne's time on stage had come to an end, his impact would never fade. Legends don't vanish. They leave behind a legacy that echoes forever. Celebrities, musicians, and lifelong friends shared their memories of Ozzy Osbourne online. Many posted old, blurry photos of wild nights, backstage moments, and emotional experiences from the road. These posts had one thing in common. They all understood they had witnessed the end of something. Not just the end of Ozzy's career, that part had already passed. Not even the end of his fame, because that would last forever. What truly ended was Ozzy's presence in the public world. The final curtain had fallen, not with drama, but with love and a powerful silence. And after that, something quieter began. Something final. After the music stopped and the spotlight faded, Ozzy returned to his home in Buckinghamshire. The estate was large and beautiful, surrounded by calm English countryside, complete with trimmed gardens and tall old oak trees. But even though the house was physically big, it had started to feel smaller. Time, illness, and the slow quiet of decline had changed everything. Several rooms had been turned into medical spaces, equipped with hospital beds, oxygen machines, and medicine refrigerators. The joyful energy that once filled the home had faded. It had become more of a peaceful care center than a rock star's mansion. Ozzy was brought inside by Sharon, his wife, always by his side. To the public, she stayed strong and focused, giving only the updates she felt comfortable sharing. But inside the house, friends said she was the emotional anchor, the one keeping everything together while watching the man she loved slowly fade. Their children were there, too. Jack flew in from Los Angeles, and Kelly cleared her schedule to spend as much time with her father as she could. Even the grandchildren were present, walking softly through the halls, sensing something serious without fully understanding it. No one in the family sat down to have a dramatic talk about what was happening. They didn't need to. They all just knew. The quiet between them said more than words ever could. Days began to follow a gentle pattern. Ozzy would usually wake up around mid-morning, after a nurse had checked his vitals and given him his medication. Breakfast was simple, sometimes just tea and toast. On his better days, he would ask to watch old horror movies or documentaries about rock music. He rarely made it through a full film, often falling asleep partway through, but no one minded. The goal was comfort. What surprised many was how calm he seemed. Ozzy wasn't angry, afraid, or restless. He was still. That didn't mean he was unaware. In fact, people said he seemed even more aware than usual. He would hold someone's gaze just a few seconds longer. He would suddenly reach out and take someone's hand, not saying anything, just making contact. It felt like he was quietly measuring his time, but without fear. Like he was slowly preparing to say goodbye. Only close friends were allowed to visit, and even then, only for a short while. One longtime bandmate described visiting as both beautiful and haunting. He expected to see chaos or sadness, but instead found Ozzy peaceful, thin and pale, but fully present in the moment. The care staff followed the same gentle routine every day. Meals were served on time. Medicine was given carefully. There were soft reminders and quiet conversations. But underneath it all, everyone knew things were getting harder. Breathing had become more difficult. Ozzy was sleeping longer, and even small gestures, like a nod or a hand squeeze, were becoming less consistent. Still, even with his body weakening, there were moments when he seemed completely clear. One evening, he sat by the window for nearly an hour, just watching the garden outside. There was no music, no talking, no TV, just silence. He stared at the swaying trees the same way he once looked at cheering crowds. Sharon asked him what he was thinking. His answer was simple. Nothing. Everything. It was impossible to know exactly what was going through his mind during those final days at home. Maybe he was remembering the past. Maybe he was fully living in the present. But everyone around him could tell. He was waiting. He wasn't fighting or retreating. He was simply waiting, like a performer who knows the show is almost over and the final curtain is about to fall. What no one realized at the time was how close that final moment really was, and that it wouldn't come in the quiet of his home, but somewhere else, even more private. In the second week of July 2025, everything changed. Ozzy was taken to a private hospital in London. The official reason was precautionary observation, but it quickly became more serious. Overnight, he developed a high fever, had trouble breathing, and became extremely tired. Because of his long medical history, Sharon didn't hesitate. She arranged a private medical transfer that same morning. At the hospital, doctors stabilized him within hours. But even the medical team, many of whom had cared for him before, noticed something different this time. The room was quiet and clinical, plain white walls, beeping monitors, and the soft sound of oxygen machines. Ozzy had never liked hospitals. He once called them grey little prisons in an interview. But this time, he didn't fight. He didn't resist the IVs, the scans, or the oxygen mask. He let the doctors and nurses do their work. According to one nurse, there was a calmness about him, not because of medicine or tiredness, but because of acceptance. He made eye contact with nearly everyone who came into the room. It was like he wanted them to see him, not as the rock legend, but as a man, present and at peace. The end was coming. And Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, was ready to face it, not with fear, but with grace. He didn't speak often during those final hours, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and meaningful. Sharon stayed close to him, never leaving for more than a few minutes at a time. She held his hand gently, sometimes running her thumb across his knuckles for comfort. Jack and Kelly soon arrived, and the two of them took turns sitting by his bedside. They didn't ask many questions. They didn't have to. The doctors had already explained that although they were doing everything possible, Ozzy's body was simply too tired to recover this time. Ozzy rested most of that second day with his eyes closed, waking only occasionally to glance around the room, as if searching for someone or something. At one point, Sharon leaned in close and quietly asked if he was in pain. He softly shook his head and whispered, "No, I'm just thinking." That night, just before midnight, the family gathered again around his hospital bed. The machines still beeped steadily, but Ozzy's breathing had slowed and become more difficult. A doctor checked his pulse and gave Sharon a small, quiet nod. It was clear, the moment was very near. Then, in a faint whisper, Ozzy opened his eyes and looked directly at his loved ones. What he said wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a long farewell speech. It was something simple, but it hit harder than any final performance could have. His last words were, "Tell them I loved doing it until the end. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart." The room fell completely silent. No one said a word. No one cried right away. They simply sat there, holding on to those final words, letting the moment sink in. A nurse later told a colleague she had never seen anything like it. "It was like he knew exactly what everyone needed to hear," she said. Like he'd been saving those words for years, waiting for the perfect moment. The next few hours passed quietly. The family didn't leave his side. They weren't afraid. They were just there with him, offering love and presence. Ozzy drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes he would gently squeeze Sharon's hand. Other times, he'd simply stare at the ceiling, his eyes slowly blinking. He never spoke again. To those who were there, it felt like all the years of fame, wild shows, personal struggles, and survival had been distilled into that one final message. It was short. It was honest. And it said everything. A thank you. A goodbye. A gift to the millions of fans who had followed him from the start. On the morning of July 22, 2025, the news broke across major networks around the world. Ozzy Osbourne had passed away. The announcement came straight from his family in a short but heartfelt message. It read in part, "With more sadness than words can express, we share that Ozzy passed peacefully, surrounded by family, love, and light. We ask for privacy as we mourn the loss of a beloved husband, father, grandfather, and icon." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, social media was flooded with messages from fans, musicians, actors, and celebrities. The phrase, "Rest in power, Ozzy," became the top trending topic for more than 24 hours. For music history, it marked the quiet end of one of rock's wildest and most unforgettable chapters. But for his family, it was deeply personal. Sharon, who had stood beside him for more than 40 years, stayed almost completely silent in the days following his passing. Those close to her said she remained composed, but the pain was visible. Sharon had always been the one to manage the business, the tours, the interviews, and the chaos. Now she was managing a much heavier burden. Grief. Jack and Kelly shared messages with their fans online. Jack posted an old photo of himself sitting on Ozzy's shoulders as a child. His caption read, "My hero, my teacher, my dad. I love you forever." Kelly's message was even simpler. "The world is quieter now. I miss your voice already." Tributes came pouring in from across the music world. Former Black Sabbath bandmates released a statement calling Ozzy the voice of a generation and a brother until the end. Tony Iommi, his lifelong friend and bandmate, wrote that he felt like a piece of my soul went with him. Artists from all genres paid tribute, including Elton John, who had once collaborated with him. He wrote, Ozzy was chaos and compassion in one soul. We'll never see another like him. But perhaps the most emotional reactions came from the fans. Candlelight vigils were held around the world. In Los Angeles, people gathered outside the Rainbow Bar and Grill on the Sunset Strip, leaving behind flowers, vinyl records, and handwritten letters. In Birmingham, England, where Ozzy's journey had begun, fans lit candles on the old factory steps where he used to walk as a young man. Even though millions were grieving, the family chose to keep the funeral private. According to sources close to them, it was a small, personal ceremony with only immediate family and a few of Ozzy's closest friends. There were no cameras, no media, no speeches, just memories, music, and a deep silence. There was talk of holding a larger public memorial later in the year, either in Birmingham or Los Angeles, cities that had both shaped and celebrated his life. For now, the world was left to say goodbye in its own way. In many ways, the quiet nature of his death felt fitting. After a lifetime of noise, rebellion, and larger-than-life moments, Ozzy Osbourne left us on his own terms, with peace, love, and a final message that will echo through generations. There was no big show, no final performance, just one last breath, taken quietly in the arms of the people who loved him most. And after he was gone, what remained was a feeling. It stayed in the echoes of every scream on stage, in every soft lyric he ever sang, and in every fan who had once found comfort in his voice. He may have left this world, but he was never truly silent, and never will be. Ozzy Osbourne never wanted to be remembered as a saint. He often joked that he'd be lucky if anyone remembered him at all. But what he did hope for, what he said many times in interviews, was to be remembered as someone who survived. And in the end, that's exactly what defined him. Not just his music, the wild headlines, or the over-the-top moments, but the fact that he endured. In the final years of his life, especially in later interviews, Ozzy became more thoughtful. He didn't focus as much on albums or awards. Instead, he talked about what it meant to keep going. A journalist who met with him in early 2025 said Ozzy told him, "I've done a lot of bad things. But I kept waking up the next day. That has to count for something." For Ozzy, survival wasn't a slogan or an image. It was real. He fought for it. Years of heavy drug and alcohol use nearly killed him many times. He had seizures, blackouts, and several stays in rehab. There were moments of public breakdowns, cancelled tours, and serious struggles with his mental health. Even his biggest fans sometimes wondered if he'd make it to another year. But every single time people thought it was the end, he came back. Maybe he walked slower, maybe his body was more fragile, but he was still here. That's what gave his final words such deep meaning. They were simple, yes, but they carried the weight of a man who had survived what most people wouldn't. He had fallen, failed, and gotten back up again, right in front of the whole world. His life wasn't polished or perfect, but it was real. And that made him powerful in a way few artists ever are. In a world obsessed with perfection, Ozzy showed us that just making it through was something to be proud of. His life proved that survival itself is a kind of success. He also changed what it means to grow old in the world of rock and roll. Most people thought he would burn out long before reaching the age of 76. But he didn't. He changed, he grew, and he found new ways to stay true to himself. After being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, he showed his fans another kind of strength, not one based on fame or energy, but on honesty and courage. That honesty is what people will always remember. The raw interviews, the hard-won wisdom, the strength to keep showing up, even when life was hard, and above all, the gratitude. Those last words he spoke will stay with everyone who ever heard him scream into a mic or speak quietly from a hospital bed. Ozzy didn't plan out his legacy. He didn't need to. He lived it, in all its chaos, heartache, and passion. And when it mattered most, he said the one thing that truly mattered. So now, after everything, what do you think of the Prince of Darkness? Let us know in the comments.